Good evening, everyone. My name is Roberta Barker, and I'm the Acting Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences at Dalhousie University. I would like to begin by acknowledging that we are in Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. This territory is covered by the treaties of peace and friendship, which Mi'kmaq, Wolastoqiyik, and Passamaquoddy peoples first signed with the British Crown in 1726. These treaties didn't deal with surrender of lands or resources, but in fact recognized Mi'kmaq and Wolastoqiyik title and established the rules for what was to be an ongoing relationship between nations. As Dalhousie University and our nation strive to continue to live up to and to live up better to these treaty relationships, I'm honored to have this opportunity to thank the elders and the guardians of this land. The relationships established in the treaties of peace and friendship speak to questions that are at the heart of the work that any Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences does. Questions about history, culture, governance, and social relationships. These questions are also reflected in 6 days. The American people will cast their votes in a range of electoral races. All of these races are crucially important, but the race on which the eyes of the world are fixed is the presidential contest between Joe Biden and Donald Trump. Because of our deep geographical, political, economic, and social ties to America, this contest and the American election as a whole will impact all Canadians. As we consider, and I know that all of us are constantly considering these impacts at the moment, as we consider them and think about them, I'm pleased to welcome you to this evening's Open Dialogue live event with interpreter Corina Burns and our 4 panelists, Ajay Parasram, Brian Bowe, Kayla Preston, and Robert Finbow, as they explore and discuss many facets of this question, including the relationships between American politics and Canada-U.S. relations, international trade, global security, issues of race and gender, and immigration, as well as the role social media has played throughout the electoral cycle. Each of our panelists will take a few minutes to share their thoughts on these questions. During their presentations, we encourage you, our viewers out there, to post your questions online. A little later in our program, we'll relay some of these questions to our presenters during a Q&A session. So it's now my great pleasure to open the floor to Dr. Ajay Parasram. Ajay is an assistant professor in the Departments of International Development Studies and History at Dalhousie, and a founding fellow at the McEachern Institute of Public Policy and Governance. Over to you, Ajay.
Thank you so much, Roberta. I appreciate that. And I appreciate how you started here. And in a lot of ways, what I'm going to share with you today speaks to the foundations of treaties and the racial politics across Turtle Island, which of course includes the United States of America. I'm going to jump rather quickly into my comments tonight because I have 3 points that I'd like to discuss with you in my first kick at the can here. And the 3 points are, so the first one is that, the way that we've been thinking about Trump versus Biden, and, it almost gives this kind of ethereal kind of good versus evil dichotomy. And I don't think that that's very healthy for reasons that I'm about to say to you. So the first point that I want to make is that President Trump, despite how he's been covered, he is not an anomaly, in my opinion. He is the dialectical response to President Obama. And he is the logical outcome that one would expect to see from a society that's been built on unresolved structural white supremacy. And that goes all the way back to, before the founding of America and to the original dispossession of the various indigenous nations across the territory of the United States, the foundations of the enslavement of Africans in American territory that established America. That was a fundamental question of discussion, at the very founding of the country. that has catalyzed a civil war in that country, and Jim Crow laws, civil rights movements, et cetera, all the way through. This has never been resolved in an adequate way. And in my opinion, President Obama, and I don't have any love for President Obama, but he was the best president that the U.S. electoral system is capable of producing, and that wasn't enough. And you could see how Obama was, he had such a fierce commitment to the democratic spirit. He was such an idealist, democratically speaking. He didn't try and shove things down, the Republicans' throat in his time there. And he was punished for it greatly, because he had 2 years when he could have done all kinds of wonderful things, and he didn't. He did some good things, but then, he had to contend with the likes of Mitch McConnell and his band of goons, and that kind of really vicious bipartisanship that targeted Obama, that could latch onto Obama, and chief among them, these kind of outlandish critics, was Donald Trump, the TV star, who everybody was writing off at the time. It doesn't surprise me that Donald Trump was elected, in part because he was the exact opposite of Barack Obama, and he could speak to the feelings of a kind of very fragile and very kind of ill-informed white majority population that was willing to punish and react and come out and support somebody who was very openly white supremacist, endorsed by white supremacists and Nazis. So I don't think that, we can't really beat around the bush when we talk about the American president. He's a white supremacist, and he's the product of a white supremacist society. And what troubles me about this is that, Joe Biden is not he's not a dialectical response to Trump. So he's not in many ways the exact opposite. And if America has shown us in the last 10, 15 years that they like to kind of push between extremes, I'm a little bit concerned about what the outcome might be, given that, the Democrats have decided to go with like the definition of a middle of the road, right of center candidate, playing it safe as they would see it. But that's playing it safe for whose interests, right? That's playing it safe to go back to a sense of normalcy that I think relied on the systematic exclusion of, Black and Indigenous and other people of color in the American polity. So that's my first point. Trump is not an anomaly. He's a very logical reaction that is indicative of a fundamentally flawed way of trying to deal with the race question in the United States. The next point is that Trump also is not the origin of post-truth. If we were to think just in contemporary terms, we have to go back to the NATO invasion of Afghanistan, that Canada supported, by the way, to see the way through which kind of lies, deception, discourse, and media manipulation was a central part of the George W. Bush administration and the people around him. We need to be paying a lot of attention to the people around him, all these presidents. What else did I want to say about that? Remember that Colin Powell, he went to the United Nations and lied effectively about what was going on in Iraq in order to drum up support for the war in Iraq, which he's not on trial here, and he's not Biden, but we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that there's actually a very long trajectory of American hypocrisy in foreign policy. So what's different? And what I mean by that is that regime changes in Latin America, in the Caribbean, in Africa, all over the world. These were things that American society was willing to look the other way on, just like American society was willing to look the other way on the race question since the beginning of the American Confederacy. So these are deep-seated issues that were never resolved, and as a result, the consequences we're now coming to live in. What else did I want to say on that subject? So the outcome of this point is that we need to stop fetishizing electoral politics and keep our focus on the things that we've seen over time that actually work, which is social movements forcing governments to do what they want, what they must, against the will of government. Government is actually not a very good tool to bring about positive social change. Government is really good at regressing social change, the frustrating social change. I think by its very nature, it is a status quo protecting public institution. And what makes governments effective is when social movements force them, put their feet to the fire, and say that they'll refuse to tolerate and build alternatives, in fact. To my mind, one of the best movements that is part of this whole process here was probably the Black Panthers, in terms of, if you look at the radical politics associated with their breakfast program, you know, like that was a way of understanding America in a complex way that didn't discriminate based on people's, you know, color of their skin or what have you. But then anyway, my last point before I talk in my remaining time about the implications for Canada is that whether Trump or Biden wins, both will ultimately fail to systematically dismantle structural white supremacy. And thus Biden, we should be thinking about Biden as a form of harm reduction in a similar way that, you know, we support, you know, safe injection sites or something like that. Biden doesn't have the chops to dismantle structural white supremacy. He can say some words about it, and I think people around the country are flocking to him as a form of harm reduction because of how bad Donald Trump has been. And to that point, to just connect this a little bit with my remaining couple of minutes to the implications for Canada, you know, we've seen since the election of Trump that the power of organized white supremacists in the United States and also in Canada has strengthened in terms of what they're willing to do publicly, in terms of shifting what is seen as acceptable in the public forum. You know, even here at Dalhousie, we've had our students, our young students, be the target of predatory white supremacist campaigns organized from the United States and influenced by people in Canada as well. So these things spill across the border, not in a literal sense, but in terms of normalizing. So we need to push back against that very hardly. And I think that it's important as a form of harm reduction to you know, hope that Biden wins, but understand that that will never be enough. And I'll leave it at that.
Thank you so much, Ajay, for those, you know, really provocative and engaging reflections that give us a lot to think about. Growing off from what Ajay has just put on the table for us, I want to now ask Dr. Brian Bowe, who is a professor of political science at Dalhousie University and also the director of Dalhousie's Center for the Study of Security and Development and a research fellow at the Canadian Global Affairs Institute, to share his reflections. So over to you, Brian. Oh, Brian, I think you may be mute.
I was muted. I'm sorry. I thought that was going to come off automatically. Okay, so Ajay's done a great job of setting the stage and thinking about putting all of this in some broader perspective in terms of what is or isn't going to solve some of the big structural problems in American society. And in a way, I'm going to kind of shrink the scope of this a little bit. And instead of taking that big picture view, I'm going to kind of zoom in a little bit on the next few months. And I want to think a little bit about what is likely to happen, what is not so likely to happen, what are some of the consequences of these different possible pathways going forward, and what are the implications for the Canada-U.S. relationship. So I'm not going to go through all of the different possible outcomes, but I do want to say a little bit about each of three different possible scenarios. The first one is a clear win for Trump and his reelection. The second is a Biden win. And then the third, a contested outcome where we don't have a clear-cut winner, and there are both political and court challenges ongoing deep into the fall and possibly even leading up close to January when the president is supposed to be sworn in. And to my mind, the primary concern here, or the thing that I want to focus on, is the potential for kind of a deep political contestation, and more importantly, sort of street violence. And my concern with that is not so much the violence itself, although obviously I don't want anybody to get hurt, and I am worried about that in its own right, but thinking about it in terms of a potential catalyst for more profound political changes in the U.S. And Ajay talked a little bit about thinking about a Biden win as harm reduction, and I totally agree with that argument, but I also am thinking about it in terms of there are different levels of harm, and the worst of all possible versions is a much more authoritarian Trump government. And unfortunately for myself, I've been thinking quite a bit about what it would take to make that happen. So to my mind, a Biden win is likely to lead to a great deal of instability over the next little while, but most of that is going to be a kind of incoherent and messy instability that comes out of people who are frustrated with that outcome, Trump supporters taking violent means into their own hands as a way of protesting or challenging the outcome. And we have seen over the last few months some examples of that. So the plot to kidnap the governor of Michigan, vigilante violence surrounding some of the street protests. These are sort of small one-off or small group acts of violence undertaken by people who are frustrated and have been misled about what's going on, or in some cases are perfectly well aware of what's going on, and who feel like violence is their best way of trying to shake things up. But to my mind, that is most likely to kind of sort itself out after a few months. And there will be lingering resentments, and the right will kind of pick up on those, and they will attempt to build them into a broader popular movement, and they will continue to try to hold on to the machinery of the Republican Party as the vehicle for doing that, and position themselves for the next election. But to my mind, that is sort of the safest and best outcome. If Trump somehow wins, given the way the poll data has been looking lately, this is going to lead to deep suspicions about him having tampered in the election, and I think there's no doubt that he will, and the only question is whether it's enough to get him some kind of a win. And to my mind, this is one of the most dangerous possible outcomes, not so much because Trump's opponents are going to instigate violence so much as that they're going to be street protests, and that will lead to violent police crackdowns, and that will trigger more of the kind of vigilante violence we've seen in Wisconsin and other places in the last few months. And that has the potential to escalate into kind of much broader action-reaction cycles where the violence kind of gets a momentum of its own. And there's been a lot of talk in the press lately about the idea of a civil war in the U.S. or the danger of a civil war. And I think that that isn't necessarily a useful way of thinking about what the risk is. None of this is going to look anything like the 1860s. If it's going to look like anything, it's going to look like coordinated street violence sort of drifting into terrorism in the way that we've seen in some other parts of the world in the last little while, and that has been going on in the Western world as well, and in the US in particular, but we haven't really thought about it as what it is, which is terrorism and political violence. So I do think there is a great deal of danger that street violence could not only happen, I mean, it will happen, but that it could lead to kind of an escalation, and that the Trump administration will certainly attempt to make use of that as a way to tighten up their control and to knock down all of the limits on their power and to push in a more authoritarian direction. That's absolutely going to happen. And then the worst case scenario is a contested outcome. It's sort of just the last thing I just described, but worse. Essentially, that Trump, we've seen, sort of pushes harder for authoritarianism when he feels like he's in trouble than he does when he feels confident and in control. And I think if there's a contested outcome and he feels like his back is up against the wall, but there is an opportunity to challenge, then he will try even harder to, and much of that will will involve putting loyalists in control of various law enforcement agencies, the military, those kinds of things, as a prelude to kind of shifting toward some kind of soft authoritarian system. So very briefly, a couple of notes about the implications for Canada of all that. My main concern with all of those things, at least in the short term, is that some of the potential for violence could spill over the border in two kinds of ways. One, in a very literal way, in the sense that people who are either escaping from the law or who are militia movements who are undertaking kind of a campaign of violence against various law enforcement or other government agencies will see crossing the border as a good way of kind of evading law enforcement and then linking up with like-minded groups in Canada possibly, and that puts the Canadian government in a very difficult position, both in terms of controlling the border, but maybe even more importantly, cooperating with American law enforcement agencies with which we do not have a great relationship right now and whose motives would be deeply suspicious. And that would lead to all kinds of very difficult choices to be made. And then, of course, there's also the risk of a more indirect kind of spillover crossing the border, where far-right ideas, militia politics, those kinds of things could have a kind of contagion effect, encouraging like-minded groups in Canada, guns, money, and ideas crossing the border into Canada, and those groups being kind of energized by polarization in the U.S. And I think that's extremely likely, and that Canadian law enforcement and counterterrorism agencies have to be very much expecting the next 6 months or so to be especially difficult, and there ought to be more resources. But obviously, there has to be a real serious attention to the idea that there is also radicalization of far-right politics in both the police and in the military in Canada, and it's not just it shouldn't just become a pretext for dumping more money on those existing agencies and asking them to do more. We should also be thinking about undertaking reforms and keeping a close eye on those agencies themselves so that they don't become part of the problem in the way that they clearly have in the U.S. over the last year or so. And with that, I will pass it on.
Thank you so much, Brian. And I think we're certainly all, I don't know if avidly looking forward, but bracing ourselves for some of those possibilities that you've outlined for us, and also looking forward, hopefully, to some better outcomes. I'm delighted now to welcome Kayla Preston back to Dalhousie. She is an alumna of Dalhousie's Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, currently a PhD student in sociology at the University of Toronto, and also a junior affiliate with the Canadian Network for Research on Terrorism, Security, and Society. We're really fortunate to have her perspective with us tonight. So over to you, Kayla.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you for having me here today. I hope I'm coming in loud and clear. So in my presentation, I just want to touch a little bit on how far-right politics have happened in the past 4 years, and what we could expect maybe moving forward, depending on the 2020 election. So to preface, I always just want to say, I want to talk a little bit about the history of the far-right in Canada and a little bit in the US. It would be wrong of us to say that the far-right in Canada is the sole product of the far-right or the rise of the right in the United States. Canada has a very long history of far-right ideas and discourses and ideologies that have been implemented into the country since colonization settlement. For example, social problems and structures in Canada, such as colonization, such as racism, have always been a product of far-right extremism and exclusionary tactics that marginalize certain populations in Canada. And the history of Canadian colonization also means that attitudes that constructed the colonial structures in our society often still remain as these structures remain. For example, certain policies in Canada have been known to be created in order to exclude people from the nation state. An example would be the limited immigration policies that we saw in the 1900s. And although some of these have been revised, the discrimination and the idea of exclusion in Canadian society and in American society still exists within the North American psyche. And people in the far right, both in Canada and the United States, often hark back to a historical time period where they believe that their countries were, quote, better off, or where they will often talk about elusive Canadian or American values that they never specify. So these ideologies have been present before Trump and will be present as these structures remain. So what has happened since 2016? So in 2016, there did seem to be a lot of activity on social media and far-right web pages. For example, in Canada, groups such as ID Canada, Yellow Vest Canada, and the Soldiers of Odin Canada and their provincial branches all appeared on Facebook and Twitter between 2017 and 2018, obviously after the election of Donald Trump. According to Statistics Canada data that was released in 2018 and 2020, hate crime rates in Canada have also fluctuated in the past 3 years. This is along with the United States. In 2017, the FBI reported that hate crimes in the U.S. Were also on the rise, while Statistics Canada stated that hate crimes in Canada rose 47% between 2016 and 2017, with over 2,000 reported incidents. It decreased a bit in 2018, about by 13%, with over 1,700 incidents. And racially motivated hate crimes made up about 43% of those reported in Canada in 2017, and 44% of those reported in 2018. So although extremism in Canada and the United States have had very different stimulants, they do share common similarities, and we're seeing very similar trends. However, it is difficult to have and to report on causation in these events. However, we can look at trends and understand the politics of the rise in the far right in Canada and the United States. And causes of the far right in the US and Canada may also be a mix of different factors that can latch on to political leaders that are, quote, speaking the language of the far right, so to say. So Trump, in the aftermath of the 2016 election, gave credence and justification for far-right attitudes, especially those around immigration. And not saying that is not important, but it is only one factor in a long list of factors that led to the far right in both of these countries. So what has happened since Donald Trump's election? So since he was elected in 2016, there has been a lot of far-right activity in Canada and the United States. So starting in the United States, the biggest example would be the Charlottesville attack in 2017, followed by the Pittsburgh synagogue shooting in 2018 and the El Paso shooting in 2019, all of which were perpetuated by members of supposed far-right groups and who had connections to far-right web pages. In Canada, the Quebec City mosque shooting in 2017 was also perpetuated by a man who was a supposed supporter of Trump and who frequented far-right web pages. And the perpetuator of the Quebec mosque shooting also had heavy influence over the shooter in Christchurch, New Zealand. This man also inscribed the Quebec man's name on one of the guns that he used in his crime. And online platforms for the far right have also been buzzing during the presidency of Donald Trump. The FBI has sent out warnings of the threat of white supremacist groups and far-right groups in the US, especially as Brian mentioned, militia groups have shown prominence recently in many states. Accelerationists, such as the Boogaloo movement, which we were hearing about, grew out of social media and internet forums such as 4chan in the United States, and they are kind of preparing for what they believe may be a second civil war. And they have been noted as a massive terrorist threat. And the Center for Strategic and International Studies in the US also reported that far-right extremism is the largest threat of terrorism in that country. Canada is also not immune to this threat. In Canada, the Security Intelligence Service also reported that far-right extremism is a major concern that they say is being monitored. So what can we expect moving forward? So unfortunately, I don't think any of us can give a clear answer as to what will happen if Donald Trump wins the U.S. presidency, or if Biden wins, and what any of these victories will completely, what it will mean for Canada. However, I can say that far-right groups will not disappear, even if Donald Trump is defeated. Donald Trump was not the founder of the far-right, nor was he their only catalyst for their prominence. If anything, Trump was only a figurehead, someone they could look up to, and someone who was speaking their language, and someone they could get behind and support. And I'm not saying that those things aren't important, but I'm saying that there are so many other factors that led to this rise of the far right. Just like the far right was here previous to 2016, it will be here after 2020 and whenever Donald Trump does leave office, whenever that may be. And when that does happen, it may just adapt itself to fit into whatever socially acceptable form of extremism and racist ideologies is accepted in our society after that. So therefore, I can't say with certainty what the defeat or the re-election of Donald Trump will mean for Canadian far-right groups. However, I think the far right is more to do with our structures, as has been repeated in this panel, than who is currently in power. And not saying that those in power can't have deep impacts on the far right, but I think that our structures need to be heavily revised. I will end with some literature that has popped up on these issues that I think really needs to be mentioned. So literature has debated the effects of politics on the increase or decrease in involvement in social movements. So a new study actually recently came out in August of 2020 in the Journal of Deviant Behavior, where Schivens, Brewis, Holt, Shermack, Freelich, and Frank found that right-wing extremist posts on a far-right webpage did spike not only after the Trump election, but also after the election of Obama in 2008. So this might suggest that posts on far-right pages may increase despite the winner of the 2020 presidential election. But of course, we'll have to see to find out how that goes in Canada and the United States. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kayla, for giving us that really strong, I think, contextual sense of the framework around the big people that we're talking about in this election. That was really fascinating. Now I'm happy to introduce, last but not least, our final speaker for the evening, Dr. Robert Finbow, who is a professor of political science at Dalhousie and also deputy director of Dalhousie's Jean Monnet European Union Center of Excellence. So over to you, Robert.
Okay, so I'm going to continue one of the themes of the presentation so far, and that is to have a time frame. And my time frame is going to be a bit different. It's going to be a 50-year time frame. Obviously, the processes that Ajay has described from colonialism and slavery and Reconstruction and Jim Crow set the stage for this. But to my mind, the major dynamic of recent times has been the dialectical response to civil rights, New Deal, Great Society. And Trump is an element in this, and an aberrant element compared to more conventional politicians, but nonetheless is currently the cutting edge and working with individuals who've been pursuing the reversal of gains of the civil rights movement and of the New Deal Great Society programs for at least half a century or more. Trump can be seen, a friend of mine sent me this proverb this week, which I think sums it up pretty well. Trump is sort of an axe. The proverb goes like this: the forest was shrinking, but the trees kept voting for the axe, as it was clever and convinced the trees that because its handle was made of wood, it was one of them. And politicians like Trump do this. I mean, they live in gilded towers, yet they convince the average citizen that they're one of them. And obviously individuals of a majority race that they're, one of them against others. And in the first campaign, he capitalized very strongly on an economic nationalist message. And one thing to keep in mind when we look for the upcoming election on next Tuesday is, of course, it is very localized, the type of results. And keep in mind that Ms. Clinton won more votes across the country than Mr. Trump did. He managed to win in a particular set of areas, and there's some research done on this, that were most affected by some of the international competition. So he was able to turn some districts that Mr. Obama had won twice in some cases, just enough in Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania to win. And so he's carried through with that. And of course, some of his measures in office have included efforts to engage in these trade wars and retaliatory tariffs, et cetera. And now, of course, many of the people who voted for him have been basically punished by that. Their economic circumstances are worse. And so he's, of course, doubled down more and more throughout his presidency on the nativism and ethnocentrism of his arguments. Now the key thing going forward to Tuesday is that it looks like he could lose the popular vote by even more. But of course, the Electoral College and the Senate remain more problematic because they're weighted very strongly toward the rural, mainstream, so-called white, heavily white states. And the other aspect that we have to consider here, and I think Brian alluded to this, is that the Republicans under Donald Trump certainly will not play fair. And one of the key features of this 50-year campaign against the civil rights movement is efforts at voter suppression. The campaign in Florida in 2016, the Republicans referred to it as deterrence, trying to make sure that as few people of color, Black, Hispanic, et cetera, were going out to vote in that state. That type of operation will be underway. There's a lot of clever ways of doing that. Fewer polling stations in minority districts. There was a court ruling, one of Kavanaugh's first decisions on the court, to prevent people from using post office boxes in the Dakotas for their mailing address, for their ballots. And of course, most First Nations people in that area had only post office boxes. So that was definitely strategically aimed at trying to prevent certain people from voting. So a lot of that's gone on. And one of the key things behind this, of course, is the role of dark money. So the rulings in Citizens United freed up a lot of money to go into political campaigns. And they have been very strongly focused on funding these fake populist movements. I don't know if any of you would have watched the confirmation hearings for Justice Barrett, but essentially Senator Whitehouse had a very impressive summation there of the way that money had gone into manipulating the appointments to the Supreme Court with three key goals in mind. And these are sort of linked, dark money, hard to trace operations. One is, of course, is social conservatism, using issues of fundamentalism, especially abortion, LGBT rights, and rolling them back if possible, as wedge issues to divide people from one another. The second set of cases that these dark money were pushing, and the justices are pushing, people who would support vote suppression. So in other words, leave states alone if they've engaged in vote suppression. And this is why the selection of the leader does make a difference, because if you look at a case like Holder, Shelby versus Holder, a lot of the protections of the civil rights era restraining states from using discriminatory electoral mechanisms were erased by that ruling. Again, they always vote in favor of unlimited campaign finance, protecting states that gerrymander. Of course, gerrymandering used to group together people usually of a minority background so they can reduce the number of seats that they're going to win. A range of other issues, economic issues like protecting companies from corporate lawsuits, privatization, of course, the ACA, taking on healthcare, regulation, etc. So there's definitely been an orchestrated sense in which these groups have been targeting policy, and they've been manipulating for the courts in that way. Right? So some of this, of course, is now set very strongly, and you probably would have seen those comments about the court where McConnell this week said, well, they can undo a lot of what we do after Tuesday, but some of this they'll never be able to reverse, which of course is his orchestrated packing of the courts. And so the courts will be very challenging for any government that tries a more progressive direction in terms of protecting voter rights, in terms of regulating the economy, green economy, etc. So some of these aspects, and the ones that concern me the most about spillovers, I guess, would be debasing the rule of law. I mean, he's basically been able to get away with substantial numbers of legal violations himself and among his family, and also pushing up against the barriers of the rule of law in a way that we really have rarely seen. And that is something that could definitely catch on cross-border. And we see people like, for instance, Southwest Nova or Central Alberta, where some of these groups have decided that the law doesn't apply to them, and they can engage in law violations on behalf of their so-called causes. That I think is a problem. The abandoning the norms of civility in general, just sort of doing away with any sense of decency. They're basically laughing it up because this justice is confirmed on Hillary Clinton's birthday, that type of thing. And of course, making bigotry and misogyny great again. So these have always existed. They're elements of our society, but he's made it very much more likely that people can openly express their commitment to these discriminatory values. And the key question is, are there going to be Canadian axes or emulators? And of course, some of this has been discussed in what Kayla had to say about the right-wing groups. But also, if we look at the top end of the Canadian political spectrum, you can see politicians starting to copy some of that rhetoric. Certainly the CPC and the UPC in Alberta with similar goals in mind. So the UPC basically is a front for privatizing and creating a two-tier health system. They've openly declared that they're going to do that now in Alberta. That is an example of the ways in which similar types of moneyed influences are going to be trying to adjust the nature of Canadian politics. Now, the media, we don't have one Fox, but we have a bunch of little mini Foxes now. And of course, the last non-conservative paper chain in the country, the Torstar, was bought by Harper loyalists recently. So, we do get a relatively distorted media filter on some of these issues. And so the rushed attempt to create jobs in the summer by Trudeau is a huge scandal, and Alberta's two-tier healthcare doesn't even get covered. But we do have a couple of advantages, I would think, because the major weakness of the United States is that the electoral machinery is complex, it's localized, it is subject to abuses, and the Canadian machinery is somewhat better. And the other thing in the short term, at least, of course, is that the courts have been somewhat more balanced. So, for instance, they may expand rights, protect Indigenous claims on resources, etc. Whereas we can expect for the next 30 or 40 years, so the upper ends of the U.S. court system will be a substantial problem for that. I do agree with Ajay that Biden is not a solution, and I think this has been going back for 40 or 50 years as well, because the progressive side of Canadian or American or British politics is always basically just neoliberalism as usual. Globalization's good, let's free up everything, there'll be new opportunities for people. And essentially what happens is a lot of people end up in a declining situation, the erosion of the middle class, job opportunities, and then they may, some of those individuals will maintain their progressive orientation. Others may listen to, snake oil salesmen from the right who offer them this populist message that we're with you, and these others are the problem. And if we can restrain the influx of others and prevent others from changing how politics is conducted, things will be better. So I definitely agree. Biden is not an improvement, but harm reduction does matter. Presumably, we won't have quite as many justices added if Biden can win in the Senate terms, which it may do, but we don't know that yet. Who will reinforce some of these difficult, locking in of some of these right-oriented policies. So there's plenty else we can discuss, and I could certainly answer questions about the specifics of the wrap-up of the campaign if anyone is interested in that. And thank you all for your interesting presentations.
Thank you very much, Robert, for summing up the 360 of the issues involved so well for us in that final statement. I think that we are now entering the question and answer period of the evening. So we're going to have all of our panelists with us for this part of the discussion. And I believe that we have some questions that are coming from our viewers that are going to be arriving for us. Here is a question from Ryan McNutt. In a scenario where Trump loses, does he or his family maintain their current grasp on the hearts and minds of America's hard right, which is one of the points that many of you really touched on, this sense of the sort of the charm of Trump and the Trump circle for a pre-existing right wing? Or does the MAGA nation seek out a new great white hope? I'm going to open that up to anyone who would like to jump in and comment on that. Brian.
I mean, the answer is that he will definitely stick around and he will do whatever he can to keep his profile up. And there will be lots of people who consider themselves loyalists to him personally. But we've seen over the last few years that there are lots of other people who want to get in on the grift. And some of them are actually a little bit more capable as public speakers and more charismatic. And as soon as Trump doesn't actually have the White House to sort of as a pillar to stand on, I expect he'll not fade from the scene, but be at least partially displaced by other people who are better at playing that same game.
And also, I mean, someone could be less problematic as a person, less mentally unstable, less directly involved in corruption, less abusive to others, and more effective, essentially, in conducting policy in the same sort of way. And that could, in fact, be more durable. I mean, the loss here, if it happens, would be because of some of those personal defects. But, a quiet Pence, could be stacking the courts the same way and easily get a second term.
Right.
But you don't think somebody like, like Richard Spencer or some kind of really outlandish far-right person, they don't stand a chance of winning these hearts and minds, eh? Because I think they'll kind of fire him, to be honest, and he won't be willing to be fired. And that would be the way I see it. I don't know. What do you think, Kayla, in terms of studying the far right?
Right. Yeah. Well, MAGA don't like losers. So
right.
what they might do is they might try to recycle Trump. I don't know if that's going to be another member of his family is going to step up. I don't know if it's, some people have talked about Tucker Carlson, maybe, maybe coming to the forefront. I don't know what that would be like. But I do think that Trump isn't going to go away, not silently at all. But I think that they will try to get some other figurehead out there very quick.
I mean, part of it depends on how the election actually plays out, and is it close enough to be discredited? Because it's clear that they've intended to discredit it. I mean, they constantly are attacking individual states based on their rules for mail-in votes or whatever else, and they've made it clear that they're going to try to make this look like an illegitimate loss if it happens. And now of course, they have this court. I don't know if anyone noticed this week that the decisions from the court, and one of his handpicked individuals, probably one of the least capable justices ever, Brett Kavanaugh, basically had this what it was apparently a very poorly reasoned argument in which he said basically that Wisconsin's, because they gerrymander, so the majority of people in Wisconsin vote for a Democratic governor, but the gerrymandering means the legislature stays in Republican hands, and they pass laws sort of saying you have to count on election night, no mail-in ballots coming in after that will be counted. And he basically wrote the decision affirming this, saying that the election's credibility would be undermined if it's not decided by midnight. Well, maybe he's dumb enough to have stumbled into an issue, because now if Trump is disputing a state and needs to dispute it past midnight, well, someone can turn around and say, well, the Supreme Court under Mr. Kavanaugh has basically said that you can't do that credibly. So, they will do everything they can to discredit it. So it has to be a really wide-ranging victory to probably make that improbable, so to the point where he has to actually accept defeat to some degree.
Thank you for those answers, everyone. We've got another question here from Alex McNabb saying, thank you for the great seminar. Supposing a Biden win, does Biden move the political trajectory of the U.S. left, or does it just pause the rightward shift? And he's added, I know it's especially hard to predict political outcomes right now, but what comes after Biden? Yeah.
I guess the Democratic establishment would want, his vice president to be, I would think, the next logical successor. And I don't think that that's going to speak to anything that can push the mainstream politics to the left, unfortunately. So I would actually say it probably would be more of a pause in this rightward shift, and then we'd have to see who the Republicans put up against them in the next election.
I mean, that's a point I didn't get to make just in the interest of time, but the cycle going back 50 years will indicate this. I mean, essentially, the right have pushed the envelope every time to the right. The Democrats or Canadian Liberals, they always usually accept what's been accomplished, and then just slightly adjust it. I mean, so he won't. Biden will not be an offensive president, offending people left and right. He could well choose, so-called moderate Republicans to go in the cabinet, like Kasich from Ohio and others. So this is not going to be a radical regime. And of course, I agree with Ajay that despite the way they try to paint Kamala Harris, she is not a radical. She's a very conservative politician, and the Democratic mold. And so that's where it's going to be for the short term. And I think in the long term, that then creates the issue whereby more and more people feel excluded, because globalization takes a lot of people down. There's no question about it. Automation, globalization, and all of these left progressive leaders, supposed progressive leaders, just opt for more of the same. And then there's more and more disaffected people, young people who don't have, the opportunities that the previous generations had, who are shopping around for something. Some of them will end up in progressive movements. Some of them will become radicalized and accept the leadership of individuals like Trump. And every cycle is worse. If you go Nixon, Reagan, the Bushes to Trump, every time it's been worse, and nothing's been done to kind of correct the excesses of those regimes back, even toward the center, frankly.
Kayla or Brian, would you like to add anything there before we go to the next question?
Well, I was going to say, we've seen that the Democrats, they don't like to rock the boat, and they seem to just want to do a level playing field. They want to play fair, and the Republicans haven't been doing that, and we've discussed that. So, do I think that Biden's going to go more left? No, I agree with what has been said. Yeah.
I think I just play devil's advocate that if there's a way that the Democrats can be shifted to the left in the next little while, it will not be in the sort of gosh, we disappointed a lot of people on the left and we better do things to make them happy. If they're going to make that shift, it's going to be because the Republicans change direction. So if the sort of far right Trumpist model is seen as a failure, and the sort of plutocratic wing of the Republican Party reasserts itself, and then all of those people disaffected with the system and with the consequences of globalization that Bob mentioned a minute ago don't see any prospect of getting what they want through the Republican Party, then there is some space for kind of realignment of the parties themselves and the Democrats to sort of switch tactics, essentially, and move to the left. But I'm pretty skeptical about that. That's the only scenario I can see it happening, but it seems very unlikely.
There are people in the Democratic Party who would take on that mission, probably the next generation, AOC's generation, for instance, right? And you need individuals who are skilled enough to be able to bridge to some of those disaffected people in Middle America, because it's not all the queens, right? You need individuals who are going to be able to demonstrate that some of what's been going on affects all of us. And the Democratic leadership has always done their best to try to dampen on that. And similarly with Liberal or even NDP leadership in Canada, basically tamp on the genuine social movement element, as we saw with how Mr. Sanders was treated. So it's the next generation's work, obviously, but it has to be done carefully and cleverly, just because of how complicated the political system is and how diverse the society is.
I think this is the problem. This is the essential problem with mainstream left, if you want to call it that, or mainstream center left, is that they are petrified always and willing to kowtow to the right. Whatever nonsense the right is throwing up there, they're always terrified of the prospect of losing power. So they'll always push. I really think, AOC is probably the only hope of shifting left that America has. And I agree, the way that things happen in Canada mirror that as well. The mainstream left has disappointed consistently.
Right. I mean, all the money I was talking about and the political system, the Constitution is unshakable. It's not going anywhere there. So the Electoral College is going to be there. The Senate, like 70% of the Senate is elected. 70% of the population elects 30% of the Senate or something like this, right? That's not going anywhere. So you've got to strategize around it, essentially, right? And somehow, I mean, I think that's a very, very tall order, which makes me generally fairly pessimistic. But some of that generation of leaders may prove me wrong, hopefully.
I think we have one more question before we close off for the evening. This is a question from Maddie Gann. Is there an opportunity, this takes us back to Canada, for the Canadian government or a collection of governments to intervene if Trump wins and moves toward a more authoritarian state? Interesting counter.
Probably not. I mean, this is appeasement all over again, right? I would have thought that, with the type of things that were done over the last 4 years, that, there would be at least withdrawal of ambassadors or some symbolic effort, to suggest that, your attacks on these systems and rights are not acceptable to us. And yet none of these countries do this, right? I mean, my spouse shares Mexican heritage, and of course people of her heritage are now locked in cages on the border, and Mexico hasn't even withdrawn its ambassador, or the Central American states. I mean, it's that's to see an intervention like that, I think is highly unlikely. I mean, the EU is one of the key disappointments in that respect, because they should be taking that kind of foreign policy leadership and don't do so.
Brian?
I think a lot depends on what you mean by intervene, right? So I think Bob is exactly right about the kind of direct diplomatic kind of confrontation is not going to happen. If it was going to happen, it would have happened already. But I do think there is room for some optimism that a lot of the countries that are sort of the traditional partners of the U.S. that have been deeply frustrated with dealing with the U.S. over the last little while will make some effort to cooperate with one another on some of the issues that matter a lot to them, and that they will form a kind of diplomatic bloc of countries who are essentially frustrated and disconnected and find themselves stuck in between a problematic U.S. and a problematic China, and but that is only a coping mechanism, and I don't expect that bloc to accomplish big and important things in the world. It'll be really much more about kind of having each other's back a little bit and finding little niche projects where they can kind of blunt the edges of some of the worst things that are happening, and having a more proactive, effort to change politics in the U.S. I just don't see it happening.
And given the interconnection of the economy, et cetera, it's very difficult for Canada to join that bloc actively, right? There's always that little sense of constraint that there's so much at stake in our relationship with the American.
And again, though, that is in some sense the way in which Canada and the Canadian left is willing to listen to the kind of dog whistling from the Conservative Party in Canada. That's like the largest cheerleader, always talking about this, like the former leader and his U.S. citizenship issue, and so they make it very difficult for, and it's not the fault of the right, mind you, they're entitled to their opinion, but it's the fault, I think, of the center and even the center left to kind of listen to them. The only kind of chance I would see would be not a formal, like intervention, but rather a disconnect. And this is something that I think internationally, this Donald Trump presidency has been kind of leading the charge on in terms of taking America out of the world in a lot of ways and turning inward. And I think, countries around the world are kind of being forced to form new trade deals, form new kind of diplomatic arrangements. And in a sense, that's not the worst thing, as we see kind of like U.S. global hegemony decline to some extent. We don't feel that in Canada, I think, as much, because we depend so heavily on the U.S. for our economic existence. But maybe there is. But I generally agree with the skepticism of the panel here. I don't know if you have a different perspective there, Kayla.
No, I agree. I mean, we haven't seen Trudeau make any big, moves towards intervening in anything to the point where I think some people would want him to. And we could have what Brian was saying, some kind of countries coming together to form other kind of trade relationships or whatnot to kind of phase the U.S. a little bit out, if that's possible. but I'm not sure if complete intervention would work, no, or would be possible.
I think we may actually have possibly one more question. I hear that we've got quite a few interesting questions up there. So we want to squeeze one more in if we can for everybody who can stick around for a few more minutes. Question for Dr. Bowe, and possibly all of you have a take, but in 2016, you argued quite well too, nice compliment to you, Brian, that Clinton is basically confirmed to win, but she lost. And it seems that Biden is in a similar position now. Does this impact your prediction? I think we all can, a lot of us can identify with this, right? Even the non-political scientists. Does this impact your prediction on how the election is going to turn out now?
So Brian,
Brian. Call it, Brian.
First, you can admit what happened.
I have been very careful not to predict anything this week, like not even the weather. So last time I stupidly went on TV and predicted, it's a slam dunk that Clinton will win. And the worst part of that was not just sort of my own embarrassment about that, but how many phone calls I got afterwards at the office from like bizarre MAGA trolls in the woods who were calling me to gloat. Anyway, I mean, I definitely am a bit sort of shell shocked about that, and it does remind us that it doesn't matter how mathematically sophisticated these models appear to be. They do not tell us with any certainty what's going to happen, and the number of things, like variables in play for these things, is enormous, and many things can happen. And this time, it's even less predictable because of all of the election interference and voter suppression and that kind of thing. So, the connection between what you see in the poll and what you get in the ballot box is not necessarily very direct. So I think, I don't want to say all bets are off, but I do want to say I'm not making any bets.
Yeah. I mean,
anyone else want to?
Sorry, you remember, Brian, that I actually called it last time, right?
Yeah.
That wasn't based on any good knowledge of statistics, but a sense of that 50-year period where those type of manipulations had occurred, as we saw with the way Florida was treated, possibly Ohio in 2004. I mean, there's a lot of manipulation that's been going on. And of course, the overall sense of disaffection from globalization, which a lot of mainstream political scientists and politicians don't want to address. And that struck me as a perfect kind of recipe for disaster.
Yeah, I mean, all bets are off right now. I think if anyone, if we knew the answer, we would be elsewhere, making a bet in Vegas maybe. But like as right now, and again, as we know about what's happening with election interference in the states, the Postal Service, what's happening there, we can't be sure. Gerrymandering, and again, as what we know about the Electoral College and how complex that goes, you can't bet at this time. So anything would surprise me, really.
Ajay, do you want to finish us off?
The U.S. in the last year and a half in particular has been behaving as if it is a failed state. And when a failed state has an election, it's very difficult to predict what's going to happen, who's going to accept what, who's going to mess around with what. And, the Republicans have been telling us, don't worry, we're ensuring that the election is going to happen and this and that and the other. I don't have a lot of faith right now. When you look at what they've allowed to happen, and I'm not just using Biden's speaking points here, but hundreds of thousands of people dead because some morons decide that masks are a bad thing. That's not a particularly American thing, but it is like a kind of spectacularly American thing at the same time. And that's not even considering the racial politics that's been at play. So I just think it's impossible right now for anyone to make a rational prediction because what's happening in the United States doesn't appear to be overly rational. And I'll leave it as that.
I think that's a powerful note on which to end a discussion in which we've heard a lot about the historical, the structural, the systemic forces of which this election is perhaps, I think, a symptom, as you've pointed out to us, and these forces that leave us in this moment of uncertainty and questioning and looking forward anxiously to next week and the weeks to follow. But I think this discussion has certainly given us a great deal more framework through which to think with and perhaps think through that uncertainty. So I'd like to thank very much Robert Finbow, Ajay Parasram, Kayla Preston, and Brian Bowe for sharing their reflections and analysis of this extraordinary moment in time that we're living through. And to thank all of our watchers and listeners for your questions and for being with us tonight. Take care, stay well, and we will look forward to perhaps discussing again on the other side. Thanks again, everyone. Good night.